various attendances if they're seen at 242 Whitehills Road, and I asked you to have a look overnight to see whether you could locate those notes. Did you have a chance to do that?
I did indeed, yeah.
And did you find any notes?
I did, of the initial visit, yes.
Right. And do you have them with you today?
Yes, I do.
Right, I call for those notes, please.
Yes, thank you. Can be produced. Yes, Mr. Armstrong.
Yeah. All right. So, Mr. Thomas, are these the extent of the notes that you made during the course of your attendance at 242 Whitehills Road?
The initial attendance, yes.
Right. And what about the, so that was the attendance in August 2013?
Correct, that's right.
Now, I thought I asked for all of the notes that you'd made as a result of your attendances, your investigations. Had you made notes in respect of the 2014 attendances when you did the excavations?
No, I didn't make notes on that occasion.
Okay. I show this page to my learned friends, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Your Honour, can I tender this page of notes that Mr. Thomas has produced, and can I describe it as a single page which appears as a diagram indicating the house, the pool, the stump, the driveways, some trees and some bush area, and perhaps we could trouble Your Honour's tip staff in due course to make a copy of the notes. And
yes, we can scan and email it as a PDF, and Mr. Tempone can add it to the court book.
Right, but thank you.
I know that it's intended. I'll just have a quick look at it. Yes. Yes, I see. Thank you.
Your Honour, I'm content if the PDF becomes the exhibit.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm indebted to my own friend, Your Honour. Now, Mr. Thomas, having seen that single page diagram, I take it then that when you were preparing in December 2018 your first report describing the conclusions that you had reached as a result of your attendances at Whitehills Road in August 2013 and March and April 2014, you were assisted by some of the photos that you'd taken, but apart from that you were going from memory.
The photos were my primary assistance, yes,
Right.
that's correct.
And beyond what you could see from the photographs, you were working from memory.
Correct, yes.
Thank you. Now, we spent some time yesterday discussing the area that you had excavated in March and April 2014. I'd now like to move to the question of the detail of the excavation work that you undertook. Now, firstly, perhaps it might help again if we could bring up the some of the photos from your first report. And for instance, could Mr. Tempone please bring up document 19 and go to court book page 0398, and we can have a look at photograph 6, which probably is sufficient for present purposes. Now, firstly, Mr. Thomas, in terms of the area where you excavated, how would you describe the soil that you were digging in?
Exceptionally dry, limited topsoil, quite rocky.
Okay, and once you got through the topsoil, I take it that the topsoil is effectively the darker grey soil that we see in this photograph?
Yes, the very limited area of darker grey, that is correct.
And it's only a few centimetres deep, if that?
That's correct, yes.
And then what we might call the subsoil, you said it was exceptionally rocky, is that right?
No, I said exceptionally dry,
I'm sorry.
And rock, there were rocks.
Right.
But I don't believe I said exceptionally rocky. I apologise if I did.
No, I apologise for misremembering. Now, in terms of that dry subsoil material, between the rocks, how would you describe the soil? Was it clay or sandy or a mix?
I certainly wouldn't describe it as being clay or sandy. It was a combination of both. It was powdery but solid in some, or more solid in some spots than others, but exceptionally dry.
All right, thank you.
Probably the best description I can give.
Okay. Now, could we have a look, please, at photograph 9 in your first report? Again, it's just another image of the same excavation work. Now, you said, I withdraw that, you said in your evidence yesterday that you excavated to a total depth of about 400 millimetres, is that right?
In that area where the spade is, I believe that's the case, yes.
Okay. And
a little behind that.
Thank you. Sorry, and a little behind that, what do you mean by a little behind that?
I excavated to a deeper level further back from the spade, but around the 400 millimetres around the area of the spade.
Okay. Now we need to get our directions and our points correct here, Mr. Thomas. When you say further back from the spade, when we look at this photograph, I think you would agree with me that the tree stump is effectively up past the top of the photograph.
Yes, that is correct, yes.
And so when you say further back, do you mean you excavated to a deeper depth between the spade as it's shown here and the tree stump, or?
That is also correct, but also further back behind the root that we can see in photograph 9. Yes, as being indicated by the cursor, back to the other root, sorry, the larger root, extending from left to right. Yes, that one. I believe that was getting around the 400 millimetre mark.
All right. Now,
as well. That's what I mean. That's what I mean by further back.
Okay. Now, all right. Thank you. And looking at this photograph and doing the best we can, given that it's a two-dimensional image, would you agree with me that the root that we see, that I think you had identified as being the partially burnt root, is the one that effectively comes down to virtually touch the top right-hand corner of the blade of the shovel?
That is correct, yes.
And you would agree with me that the root there seems to be extending from the grey material of the topsoil, and to the extent that one can make any judgment at all about how deep that root had been, it seems to have been in the soil, either running through the topsoil or at the upper reaches of the subsoil, very close to the topsoil. Do you agree?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Now, you gave evidence yesterday that, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it took you about 2 hours, was that right, to excavate?
I think it was between 2.5 and 3 hours.
Okay. And that 2.5 to 3 hours was the work that was the time that was taken to do the whole of the excavation that is shown, for instance, in photograph 12. And if we could bring that up, please. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Now, Mr. Thomas, do you say that you managed to achieve all of that excavated area using just the little garden trowel and a paintbrush, and you did it in 2 hours?
I think I said 2.5 to 3 hours.
Okay, 2.5 to start
with. I was on my hands and knees for that period. If we go back to photograph 9, I think it was, that we were looking at a moment ago. Yes, the boots that you can see on the left-hand side of photograph 9, the pair of trousers, that is actually my son who's holding the shovel vertical. And I placed the top, so he was there assisting me. I placed my son, I placed the dirt that I took from the dig onto the shovel, and he shovelled that away. So I was on my hands and knees. I think my knees are still recovering, actually. On my hands and knees during the entire excavation period. And my son would, as the shovel would fill, I'd tell him where to put that dirt.
Well, Mr. Thomas, can I put it to you that, in fact, what is a much more plausible account for the way that you undertook this work was that you used the shovel to at least excavate away the, and I repeat, used the shovel to excavate away the topsoil and loosen the subsoil, and then started to use the garden trowel once you got into an area where you had detected a root.
No, that's not correct.
All right. Now, when you were... So is it your evidence to His Honour that you were using the little garden trowel and actually putting the soil that you scooped out with each little scoop onto the blade of the shovel while your son held the shovel, and then he went and distributed that soil around the area?
Correct, that is correct.
Now, when you were undertaking that investigation, you were looking for roots showing signs of burning, weren't you?
I was looking for roots showing signs of burning. I was looking for any charcoal that might be apparent, and I was looking for any holes that might be apparent.
And the hypothesis that you were investigating, you understood was a hypothesis that the burning root that the TFS investigators had identified was, sorry, the burned root that the TFS investigators had identified was a root emanating from the subject stump, correct?
That's what the TFS report detailed, yes.
And you understood that the hypothesis was, the TFS conclusions had been, that the campfire that had been ignited in the tree stump had smouldered along the root system out to the point where the TFS had then found the signs of the burned root, correct?
Correct, yes.
And so you would agree with me that the further one gets away from the tree stump along the burning root, the further you get away from the stump, that means the less time that that particular section of root had been burning.
Sorry, I don't understand your question.
I'll try and rephrase it. You understood that the hypothesis was that the campfire had started in the tree stump.
Well, I believe that there was information that there was a fire in the tree stump on the 28th of December.
Yes. And you understood that the hypothesis was that that campfire had then ignited at least one root in the tree's root system.
That's what the Fire Brigade claimed,
Yep.
Yes.
And that ignition of the root had led to a smouldering burn.
Yes.
And that smouldering burn had worked its way out from the tree stump along the root.
Correct, yes.
So along that burning root, the part that was closest to the tree stump would have been burning for longer than the part of the root that was further away from the tree stump. Would you agree?
Most probably, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
Oh, definitely it would have. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
How long that period of time is uncertain, but certainly it would have been burning for longer the closer to the stump than the end of the root, yes.
And you understood that the conclusion that the TFS had reached was that it had in fact taken something like 6 days for the smouldering burn to extend from the location of the campfire out to the point where the TFS had identified the likely point of origin of the fire to have been.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And so you would understand from that that it was supposed to have been a relatively slow-moving smouldering burn.
Would have had to be a slow-moving smouldering burn, one would think.
And you would expect from a very slow-moving smouldering burn like that, that there would be very complete consumption of the wood tissue of the root over the course of the smouldering burn. Would you agree?
I would expect that there'd be some residue left of a smouldering burn. I don't believe that there'd be complete consumption of a smouldering burn.
Well, you would expect that a route like the kind that the TFS had identified, if it had been allowed to continue to burn in a smouldering fashion underground for something like 6 days, then the parts of the route that had been burning for something like 6 days were very likely to have effectively been carbonised, that is, or vaporised, reduced to carbon powder.
The majority of the route, yes, I'd agree with you, but I still believe that there would be some evidence of the root structure left, and the simple reason for that is that it's not solids that burn; it's the gases and vapour that burn and even smoulders. So once the gases and vapours are given off during the smouldering process, there's no further gas or vapour to be given off, and some residue would remain. That's the reason why even with our wood heaters that are designed to burn, we always have some residue in the base of our wood heaters at the end of the day, when it's been shut down for a period of time and as a smouldering burn.
And even taking the example of a wood heater, if you leave the wood in there long enough, what you end up with is a very fine powder ash.
Correct, yes,
right.
But there's always some residue left. Yes. In the wood heater. There's never complete consumption.
No, I accept that, but the residue that might be left might be nothing more than powder.
Oh, small coals, powder, extending from powder to small coals, depending on how the burn occurs. But there is always some residue.
And you would agree with me that if there had been a smouldering burn in a relatively small diameter route of the kind that the TFS had reported, and that smouldering burn had endured for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days, it's very likely that what would be left of the burned section of root would be nothing more than powder.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Mr. Thomas may not recall, he may, but without being reminded as to those dimensions. The dimension of the...
Certainly right. Well, Mr. Thomas, do you recall that the TFS had identified the route that they had sought to investigate as a route that was really no more than about 20 millimetres in diameter?
My understanding was 20. I was always basing my estimates on 20 to 30 millimetres diameter.
And so, again, just to be clear, and having offered that clarification, I put it to you that it's very likely that if a route of that kind of diameter had been subject to smouldering burn for 4, 5 or 6 days, it is very likely that there would be nothing left of the root except powder.
No, I cannot agree with that, I'm sorry.
All right. Now, over time, given what you experienced of the soil in the area that you were excavating, to the extent that there had been any cavity left in the soil as a result of a root, the mass of a root being reduced through smouldering burn, you would consider it very likely that this relatively loose soil would fall in on the cavity and fill it. Would you agree?
I'm not sure that I'd agree that it would be very likely. It's possible, okay, but I wouldn't agree that it's very likely.
All right. And in relation to this photograph that we see on screen at the moment, I'm not sure if it's the best one that we've got of what you identified as the burnt root. Perhaps we can go to photograph 7. And in relation to that burned root, Mr. Thomas, did you find the bits of it that had burned?
No, I found the end of the root.
Right. Did you look for the bits that had burned?
That was all that was left of that
right.
end of the root.
Okay. So as you were excavating that end of the root, did you find a charcoal path extending from the still solid part to indicate where the root had previously run?
No, there was a hole apparent of where the root had previously run, but that was close to the surface, and no, there was no residue left in that instance.
All right. And you didn't take any photographs of the soil around or extending past the end of this route to indicate what, if any, signs there might have been in that soil that there had ever been a route running through it, did you?
I think if we go back, maybe from recollection, photograph 5 is before I commenced any of my dig.
Yes.
And we have those, the two, or it looks like there's two holes, one to the immediate left of the rectangular shaped rock as it's been referred to previously, and another, yes, that's right, where the cursor's alluding to. There's another hole off to the, slight hole off to the left of that as well. So that was what I was greeted with at the commencement. And the charred route that I'm referring to, or that we've been referring to in photograph 9, was not terribly far in from the hole that we see. From recollection, it's the right-hand hole, the larger hole. So that was quite exposed.
All right. Well, could we please? Could I trouble Mr. Temponi, and this might be testing his considerable skills even more than they've been tested so far. Is it possible to show photograph 5 next to photograph 6, even just by taking a screenshot? Thank you. Now, I hate to trouble you with angles again, Mr. Thomas, but at least we have photographs here that were taken at approximately the same time, and so we've got the stump itself at least looking in the same condition. Now, you said that the burned route, you said in your answer a moment ago that the burned route you located in the area of the right-hand black hole that we see in photograph 5. And is that still your recollection?
It may well have been the left-hand hole. What I think I did say either or. I thought it probably was the right-hand hole, but looking at the photograph, it may have been closer to the left-hand hole.
Okay. And again, you didn't take any photographs of the soil within or around the left-hand hole as you were excavating, did you?
None closer than that identified in photograph 5.
Okay. And I can only put this to you, Mr. Thomas, but looking at the angle of those two photographs, I must say it does appear that the burned route seems to be even further left than the left-hand hole. Would you accept that?
No, I
plausible?
don't believe that to be the case.
All right. Now, you don't suggest that this burned route is the route that had been identified by the TFS, do you?
No, I don't. No, I can't. I didn't have sufficient evidence at the scene for me to be able to determine that.
Could those photographs be held there for a moment? Because I have one question that's conveniently asked while they're up. Mr. Thomas, it can be easily seen on the image on the right-hand side of your screen that the soil is very grey. Is it the case that there was a depth of ash before the topsoil, or is it the case that as you excavated, the falling ash on the top of the ground discoloured the soil?
No, I believe that the photograph on the right that Your Honour refers to, photograph 6, I believe that quite accurately reflects the colour of the soil. If we look on the right-hand side near where the pick is, we can see the topsoil, clearly the darker colour, and then the lighter soil under that.
So was there no ash on top of the topsoil?
No, not that I saw, Your Honour. And that's demonstrated in photograph 5.
Thank you.
Before I commenced.
And just on that issue, Mr. Thomas, given what you had seen of the TFS photographs of this area back in January, you would agree with me that the fuel across this space was extremely light, wasn't it?
Yes, it was certainly not quality soil that produced quality vegetation. It was quite barren land.
Why are you smiling, Mr. Thomas?
The reason I'm smiling is that quite often when I view land like this, I have a terminology that I use.
I don't think we need to be squeamish about it, Mr. Thomas.
No, well, the terminology that I use is that the land is that poor that a hungry goat would struggle to survive in the area with the vegetation. So that's just a joke that I've always used from travels around Yugoslavia and goats and whatever in that area. So I apologise for my somewhat strange
It's given me
humour.
a unique search term.
For my part, Mr. Thomas, I've done bushfire cases in many places, but I'm looking forward to my first in Yugoslavia. Now, because of that very light fuel, you would expect that really as a fire, even the early stages of a grass fire moved across that area, there would be really very, very little ash produced as well, because there's just not much material there to produce ash.
Correct, yes, very fine material, the grass.
All right, now you also mentioned, and it's conveniently shown in photograph 6 at the moment, the pickaxe. Could you tell me again, please, what the pickaxe was used for?
It actually wasn't used, as I recall. I took it on the belief and having visited the scene previously, knowing that there were some quite large rocks. I took it in the event that I needed that for leverage purposes on a large rock, but I don't recall that I did.
All right, thank you. Now, again, I think it's probably enough to... Well, I'm trying to find the best photo for you, Mr. Thomas. Your Honour, would it be of assistance at all if we took a screenshot of the screen as it is at the moment, so that Your Honour has the two photos side by side?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Timponi, could you do that? And I'll tender the screenshotters. Really, it's probably just an aide-memoire, but might be a convenient one.
Yes, thank you.
Now, Mr. Timponi, could you please take us to photograph 8?
Still working on the screenshot, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. And could you zoom in on the roots, please, Mr. Timponi? That will do. All right. Look, that's probably enough for present purposes. Your Honour will recall that the originals of these photographs are in the court book, but I think that this version of the image is sufficient for the next question to Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, what we see there again is the burnt root, but now without the shovel in front of it. Would I be right in perceiving that what seems to be the case shown in this photograph is that you had the root that was obviously burned very close to other roots that did not appear to have been burned?
Correct.
Right, thank you. And that's not surprising to you, is it? You would expect that a smouldering burn along the root would follow very closely just the space filled by the particular root that was burning.
Correct, unless of course the roots were in contact with each other.
Yep, thank you. And even if they were in contact, there would need to be sufficient contact between them that there could be enough heat transfer from the burning root to then start a propagating smouldering burn in the second root.
Well, to start smouldering in the second root, or to generate sufficient heat into the second root to cause gases and vapours to start to be given off, and
thank you.
The decomposition.
All right. Now, in the course of your investigations, your excavations, you did not identify at any stage the route that you thought was the route that the TFS investigators had been excavating, did you?
Sorry, I don't understand your question.
In the course of your excavations, you did not find the route that you understood the TFS to have identified as the burning route, did you?
No, I couldn't be certain of anything in that regard, but clearly there was no evidence of a smouldering route from the stump that extended below the ground during my excavation.
Okay. Now, you returned to Whitehills Road a week later in April 2014, and you took then a number of photos that some of which you exhibited to your first report as photographs 13 through to 18. Is that right?
That's as I recall it, yes.
And so could we go to the photographs 15 and 16 to your first report? I should ask you this as well, Mr. Thomas. In your first report, you said that you give the date of your attendance at the scene as August 2013, and there's nothing in this report that indicates that the excavation work was not done for another 7 months, is there?
Oh, I can't recall what's in the report.
Okay, could we go to the start of document 19? Can we go to page 0393? So just pause there. You see attendance at scene, Mr.
Yep, that's correct.
And you said 20 August 2013.
Yes.
Now, could we display this page next to the following page, 0394? And can we see the whole of both pages? Thank you. Now, so you see on the left-hand page, 20 August 2013. Can I draw your attention now to section 3 on the right-hand page, examination of scene. Now, would you agree with me? So I will just enlarge it for you so that it's a bit easier to read.
Thank you.
Can I draw your attention to 3.1 and 3.2?
Yes.
Those refer to investigations that you conducted in August 2013, don't they?
Correct, the outer perimeter, yes.
And then 3.3 and following refer to photographs that you took in March and April 2014, don't they?
That is correct, yes.
Now, I did have to ask you, why doesn't this report mention at least that there was 7 months difference between paragraph 3.2 and paragraph 3.3?
it doesn't. No particular reason why it doesn't.
Well, we're talking about the physical indicators of a bushfire, Mr. Thomas. They degrade over time, don't they?
They do, yes.
And 7 months difference in time is likely to involve the risk of some significant degradation of the physical evidence that might be available to indicate how a bushfire started.
That is absolutely correct, but I don't believe that relates to any evidence which would be protected by the ground which was above it, such as the root structure.
Well, you were aware that this ground had been driven over or driven near by fire trucks, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
And it was next to a driveway?
Yes.
There were horses that walked in the area?
I believe so.
Lots of opportunity for vibration, isn't there?
Correct.
It's loose soil.
Well, loose-ish soil, yes.
And there's the possibility that what's happened here is that there's been a smouldering burn along the extent of a root leading to a tunnel cavity in the soil, and there's every possibility that the vibration over the course of a year or a further 7 months might have shaken the soil down into the cavity, causing the evidence to disappear. Would you agree?
Anything is possible, I'd agree with that. However, I believe if there was ash or whatever along a route, a smouldering route, that there still would have been evidence of that, even if the majority of the hole that route extended through had compacted.
Right. And
for whatever reason.
And back to the burning route that you identified in your photograph 5 or 7, 8, 9 or 10. You didn't take any photos of ash extending beyond the end of that route?
No, there wasn't any.
Right. Okay. You're not suggesting that that route stuck straight out through the side of one of those black holes that we saw in photograph?
It was very close to one of those holes. I can't recall how far in, but it was very, very close.
Right. And you didn't think to take a photo to show how close it might have been?
Well, I'd already commenced the examination of the scene.
Right.
I took the photo before I commenced, and then I took the photos as I progressed the excavation along the root structure.
And I take it the significance of that answer is that as you dig, you are effectively dislodging, disturbing and causing to disappear any powdered ash that might have been extending past the end of that route. There's nothing left to photograph.
Well, I did my very best to ensure that that didn't happen, Mr. Armstrong, by removing the dirt in layers with the trowel and dusting off around the roots with a paintbrush.
Well, simply dusting is going to move the powder, isn't it?
If there was powder, yes.
Right. So you didn't see any powder extending beyond that route?
No.
Okay. But you don't recall whether the end of the route actually protruded through the side of the
No,
hole?
I can't recall whether it did, but if it was very close to very soon after I commenced to dig, and I believe that is demonstrated in the photographs, or by the photographs as well.
All right.
That it was very near the start of the dig.
Now, could Mr. Tempone please next take us to photograph 16? Now, Mr. Thomas, I take it that that is a photograph of the subject stump after your excavation.
Correct, yes.
And just to be clear, that is a photograph that shows the extent of the excavation that you did around the bowl, B-O-L-E, of the stump.
That is correct, yes.
And
apart from that, which is shown obviously in photograph 13, I think it is, where I traced the root structure from the eastern side towards the western side.
certainly, just to be fair to you then, can we also see photograph 13?
Yes.
And so I take it, Mr. Thomas, that what we see in the process was that you did the excavation that we see in photograph 13 that led you to effectively the northern or northeastern edge of the stump, and then you excavated around the circumference of the stump.
That is correct, yes, absolutely.
And the circumference excavation is what we saw in photograph 16.
It's what you see in photograph 13, yeah, through. Yes.
Well, sorry, just to be clear then, you say it's what you see in photograph 13 through.
Or photograph, if we can just scroll through the photographs.
So 14 is again the excavation toward the stump.
That's correct, yes.
15 seems to be one
It's a
side of the stump.
Correct, absolutely.
And the photograph of the excavation around the circumference of the stump, or as far as you went around the stump, is photograph 16.
I believe that's correct, yes.
All right. And are you able to tell, looking at that photograph, which direction the camera is pointed?
I think, to the best of my recollection, I believe it is pointed from the west looking towards the east.
All right, thank you. And again, doing the best we can, Mr. Thomas, it looks like the excavation around the circumference of the stump is really only maybe 100 to 150 millimetres down. Is that right?
Yes, I'd agree. About 150.
So it's nothing. It couldn't remotely be described as a full excavation at the stump, could it?
No.
And you have really no idea what the root structure of the bole, B-O-L-E, might have been below the soil that we can see in this photograph. Do you?
No, I don't. No.
All right. All right, now can we move to your second report, please, Mr. Bones? I beg your pardon, Mr. Thomas. Sorry. Now, I take it, Mr. Thomas, that this report, at least, you did expect would be used in evidence in court proceedings.
I can't recall the date of that
I
report.
didn't ask you about the date, Mr. Thomas. I asked you about the purpose.
I wasn't sure whether this report would be used in court proceedings or not, no.
Okay, but did you prepare this report on the assumption that it might well be?
I prepared the report for Mr. Knight under instruction.
Okay, and for the purpose of preparing this report, at least you were provided by Mr. Knight with a copy of the Expert Witness Code of Conduct, weren't you?
I can't recall, I'm sorry.
All right. Well, can we go to the next page, page 0407, Mr. Temponi. Draw your attention to paragraph 1.8.
Yeah.
So,
having had my attention drawn to that, yes.
right, so to be clear, your recollection was that you had been provided with a copy of the Expert Witness Code of Conduct?
Yes.
And you understood that the Expert Witness Code of Conduct was a code that applied to the obligations of witnesses who were proposed to be called to give expert evidence in this court?
Correct, yes.
And you assumed from that this report might well be used as an expert report in court proceedings?
No, I didn't assume that.
Right.
The report was prepared under instruction from Mr. Knight, as I said before.
Okay. Now, we can see that you did not use this second report as an opportunity to elaborate on any of the processes or reasoning that might have informed your conclusions that were summarised in your first report, did you?
No.
And this second report was really prepared as what we might call a desktop response to the Tasmania Fire Service fire investigation report.
My understanding is the report was prepared to answer specific questions which were asked of me.
Okay. You didn't undertake any fresh inquiries for the purpose of preparing this second report, did you?
No.
You just looked at the Tasmania Fire Service report your first report, your photographs, and then provided an answer on that basis.
Correct, yes.
Now, on the next page, sorry, page 0409. In fact, perhaps we can, Mr. Temponi, is it convenient for you to be able to show page 0408 and 0409 together?
Well, the answer is no, but he will.
He has a high threshold for convenience, Your Honour.
Mm.
Thank you. So, what have we got there? Response. So you see there, Mr. Thomas, that you're responding to the report of Mr. Bones, and I actually thought I'd said Mr. Temponi's 0408 and 0409. Thank you. So, just reverse the order of the pages, please, Mr. Temponi. That's fine. Beautiful. Thank you. Now, firstly, in the third paragraph on the right-hand side, Mr. Bones, is the paragraph starting as detailed in my initial report. Do you see that?
Yes, yes.
Now, the second sentence there, starting the excavation, you would agree with me that that's not an accurate sentence, is it? At least to the extent that it might be suggested as indicating that you exposed the whole of the root structure of the stump. We've now seen that you didn't do anything like that, did you?
I excavated the scene around the perimeter of the stump. I didn't excavate the scene entirely around the stump to the extent that I did in, I think it's photographs 6 through 12 or whatever, along the root structure from the eastern side. No.
All right, thank you. And then in the second last paragraph of that section starting, I would suggest the charring.
Yes.
See that?
Yes.
Now, your proposition there is that the charring to the root depicted in Mr. Bones' report was caused by the bushfire rather than a potential cause of the bushfire, correct?
Your Honour, I object to that question. It's a reference to a route shown in Mr. Bones' report. If my learned friend can be clear as to what route he's referring to, shown in the report.
Certainly. Well, perhaps I'll throw that question to you, Mr. Thomas. You're referring there to charring depicted in photographs in Mr. Bones' report. Could you tell His Honour which photographs you have in mind? Perhaps describe them and then I'll see if I can find them for you.
Yes, there's some photographs of some charred root. I believe they were near cone 20.
All right.
In the report.
Okay,
So,
so
Mr. Bones.
thank you. Could Mr. Temponi bring up document 24 and we'll go to page 0054. And so just to give you your bearings, can we just go to the preceding page, Mr. Temponi? Just the bottom photograph will suffice. So there's the shovel relative to the stump.
Yes.
And then down, that's the charring that you're referring to.
Yes.
All right. Now, so just to clarify with you then, this second last paragraph, when you say I would suggest the charring depicted in those photographs has occurred as a consequence of the fire rather than being the cause of the fire, Firstly, do you mean to say there that you suggest that the charring to the root that's depicted in the photographs has occurred as a consequence of the fire?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. Now, it was and is your understanding that the only fire activity that occurred in the area excavated by the TFS or excavated by you was the fire activity associated with the very early low intensity stages of this particular wildfire. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've already given evidence to His Honour this morning that there was very sparse and fine fuel in that area prior to that fire.
Correct, yes.
I think you agreed with me before that such fine fuel would very quickly be incinerated.
Yes.
And it would leave very little ash behind.
Depending on the intensity of the fire, of course. If it's a very slow fire, there may well be some residue left. If it's very fast, it would be completely gone. But my understanding is that in the initial stages, this was a slow-moving fire.
Okay. And so what's the significance of that for your analysis? Does that indicate that you would have expected more vegetable remains to have survived the passage of the fire?
I'm not certain about that,
right.
Because we're dealing with a hypothetical. I don't know how fast the fire was. My understanding is it was a slow-burning fire. I don't even know how much fuel, combustible material, was actually present at the time of the fire.
Well, you'd seen the photographs of the area around the stump that had been taken in the days immediately following the fire, hadn't you?
The Tas Fire Service photographs, yes.
Yes. And did you expect from the photographs that you could see of the area that prior to the fire it had been very fine fuel, fine grass and maybe some leaf litter?
I assume that to be the case, yes.
Right. And you were aware of what the weather conditions had been on the day?
Yes.
You understood that it had been quite a strong westerly or norwesterly wind?
Correct, yes.
And that the reports of the early stages of the fire indicated that it had run towards the east under the influence of that westerly wind?
Correct, yes.
Were you aware of any reports of the fire having also backed into the wind?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Okay. Well, would you expect that a fire igniting at a point within the area of confusion, sorry, I'll try and use your language, would you agree that a fire igniting in those wind conditions, those general weather conditions, on the 3rd of January 2013 in the area of origin was firstly very likely to run towards the east under the influence of the westerly wind?
If you're referring to the area of origin, is that determined by the Tas Fire Service?
Yes.
In their report, yes, I would expect it to run towards the east.
And in addition to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And there was evidence to support that
Yes.
in the treed area
Yes.
of the land.
Thank you. And would you expect that a fire igniting in those conditions in that area would also have spread, at least to some extent, laterally across the path of the wind as a flanking fire?
May well have, yes.
And again, covering the last compass point, would you expect that a fire igniting in those conditions in the area of origin would also have backed at least a little bit into the wind?
May well have. My understanding is that the wind was quite strong, so I would have thought that the wind would have pushed the majority of the heat that was being generated by the fire in that easterly, southeasterly direction.
All right, thank you. Now, I think you just referred to the heat that was generated by the fire. Would you agree with me as well that the heat generated by a low intensity fire in its very early stages, if it were ignited in that area of origin, would mostly go up?
Heat rises. It's a simple scientific fact.
Yep, thank you. And I put it to you, Mr. Thomas, that a very low intensity early stages fire igniting in this area of origin in the conditions that existed on the 3rd of January 2013 would be very unlikely to endure for long enough near a tree root protruding slightly from the surrounding soil, such that the fire would be able to transfer enough heat into the tree root to start a smouldering burn that was then able to self-sustain as a propagating burn.
I think I understand your question. Depends on the fuel, the combustible materials in the immediate vicinity of the root at the time.
Well, I just asked you to make some assumptions about the fuel that was available in the area. I think you've agreed that it was fine grass and perhaps some leaf litter.
I don't think there's any doubt there would have been leaf litter.
Right.
And that's what causes me concern, is the grass in the area would be... There's nothing to suggest that isn't anything other than fine grass. But the leaf litter, goodness knows what that might have been, and that may well have... it certainly becomes combustible load, fuel load.
Nevertheless, Mr. Thomas, I put it to you that in those conditions, firstly, vegetable dry leaf litter lying between the grass blades is likely to have been very dry and also likely to burn very quickly and then extinguish because it had burned away completely.
I'm feeling uncomfortable, Mr. Armstrong, with the questioning because we're making many assumptions in all of this, and I'd rather not make assumptions in expressing an opinion.
Well, did you see any signs, Mr.
Which you do all the time as an expert, isn't it?
Yes, but attempt to do that based on the facts that we can identify, Your Honour.
Well, you're being asked to answer questions based on assumed facts.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to be unfair to you, Mr. Thomas, so let's just break this down. I think we've agreed that there was sparse, very fine and very dry grass scattered across the area of the excavations prior to the fire. Correct?
I'm happy to assume that, yes.
Right. So let's call that area the northern side of the stump, shall we?
Yes, if you wish.
And in addition to the grass that I've just described, so no, before I move off the grass, you would expect that any fire, even the early stages of a grass fire, igniting in the conditions that existed in the early afternoon of the 3rd of January 2013, would very quickly have completely consumed the grass. Each grass stem.
It would have consumed the grass. Based on my understanding, it was consumed reasonably quickly, yes. But now what reasonably quickly is, 5 minutes or so,
Right.
is what I'm assuming in answering that question.
So are you suggesting, Mr. Thomas, that a flame applied to a blade of grass in the conditions that we're talking about would have taken 5 minutes to burn that blade of grass?
No, not at all. No, I'm talking about the area.
Okay.
The area, the grassed area.
All right. So what to be clear then, what you're suggesting is that that entire area that was ultimately excavated might have taken 5 minutes before all of the grass that was exposed to a flame was completely consumed.
I wouldn't disagree with that, no.
Okay. And would you accept that, in fact, if the fire was moving fairly quickly under the wind, then that 5 minutes is likely to reduce very significantly?
Correct, yes.
Do you agree with me that any given blade of grass, once exposed to a flame in those conditions, would have been completely incinerated in a relatively small number of seconds?
Yes.
A relatively small number of seconds.
Yes.
Thank you. Now let's move past the grass to leaf litter. That was the other type of fuel that you expect was likely to be in that area to the north of the stump prior to the fire, correct?
To the north of the stump?
The area that was ultimately excavated.
That was to the east of the stump, wasn't it?
North and east.
Yes. There'd also be bark off the trees as well, but leaf litter and bark. Normal bushfire, forest fuel residue.
Right. And from what you had seen of the wider area around the tree stump, had you seen anything to indicate to you that there had been a substantial build-up of leaves or bark in that area?
No.
Or that it was relatively clear?
It was, from what I saw, it was relatively clear, yes.
So if there was bark and leaf litter in the area that was ultimately excavated, then there was likely to be not much of it. Would you agree?
I think that's a reasonable assumption, yes.
Okay. And would you agree that the bark and leaf litter as well, by the 3rd of January 2013, was likely to be very dry?
Particularly that any that was towards close to the surface, yes.
Right. And accordingly, would you agree as well that that bark and leaf litter, once exposed to a flame, was also likely to be incinerated in a matter of seconds, albeit perhaps more seconds than it would take to incinerate a blade of grass?
Certainly longer than the blade of grass, yes, but that depends on so many things: wind direction, the position, the density, etc.
All right.
Where a blade of grass is standing vertical, the heat's rising, totally different situation to something that's horizontal.
Well, you've mentioned the wind position, density, and what was the third thing?
I think I was saying how...
The position, sorry.
Whether something was vertical or horizontal.
Okay, so let's just work through that. We know that it was a westerly wind, don't we?
Yes. Yeah, westerly, northwesterly.
Okay, so please continue to assume that it was a westerly or northwesterly wind. You've already given evidence that you, so far as you've seen any record of what the level of bark and leaf litter was in the area that we're talking about, there was not much of either of it, was there? There was not much bark or leaf litter in the area.
I don't actually know what was there, but based on everything that I saw around the property, there probably, stress the word probably wasn't a large amount. I've certainly seen many larger build-ups of what I term forest fuels than in this situation. But I don't know what was there at the time of the fire.
All right. And then the third variable that you mentioned was the position of the bark or leaf litter. What do you mean by position?
Yes, so if something's vertical, the grass, we obviously know that that's vertical. The heat's going to rise. As you correctly detailed, the grass is going to burn quite quickly. Right. With leaf and bark, we don't know how long the piece of bark might be. We don't know the shape of the piece of bark. I've seen bark act like a chimney. It's horizontal. It's on the ground, and the heat's rising and dissipating into the atmosphere as a result of heat rising.
Right. Now, in terms of having regard to what you had seen of the area around the tree stump, burned and unburned immediately after the fire, you would expect, wouldn't you, that firstly any leaf litter would be consumed by a flame very quickly, again likely to be measured in seconds rather than minutes.
Depends on how thick the leaf litter is.
All right, can we
certainly I agree with
the question was predicated on based on what you had seen, burned and unburned.
Do you see?
Based on what you've seen.
Your Honour's quite right. Mr. Thomas, had you seen anything in the photographic record of this fire to suggest that there was anything other than virtually a single layer of a few leaves lying between the grass blades?
anything that was there had been consumed.
Okay. Did you have
that's clearly evident in the fire brigade photographs.
All right. Could we go to the fire brigade photographs? It's document 24 again. And can we go, for instance, to... In fact, I'll show you some better photos. Mr. Thomas, could we go to document 101? And start with photograph 1. Now, do you recognise that area, Mr. Thomas?
Yes, I do.
Okay, there's actually a better photograph. Can we go back to the thumbnails, please, Mr. Temponi? Let's get a bit closer. Can we go to photograph 3? Now, you see some areas there that have not been burned, don't you, Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Can we go to another one? Can we go back to the thumbnails, please, Mr. Temponi? And can we have a look next at document 6? Now, by all means, Mr. Thomas, tell us if you need the photograph to be zoomed, to be enlarged at all. But I'll put the question again. Do you see anything in the unburned areas shown in this photograph to suggest to you that there was leaf litter to any significant depth, likely to have been leaf litter to any significant depth in any of the areas that had been burned?
There's nothing on the areas that hasn't been burnt to suggest that, and this photograph really is of great assistance to me in making that answer. So,
okay, good. So would you agree with me then that whilst we can all understand that a dense layer of leaf litter is likely to involve higher intensity burning and burning over a longer duration, the leaf litter that is likely to have been in this area and available to be burned by a fire that started in this area was likely to be consumed in a matter of seconds?
Possibly, yes.
Thank you. And again, please, by means of reference to this photograph or any of the photographs I've taken you to so far, do you see signs of any significant pieces or volumes of bark lying in this area?
No, I can't.
Right. And so there's nothing in the evidence, the evidentiary record available to you to suggest that bark might have been a significant fuel load that had been available in the burned area prior to the burn, is there?
No, that's correct.
All right. So putting all of those factors together again, Mr. Thomas, would you agree with me that the available evidence suggests that there was a very light fuel load in the area before it started to burn, and the load was likely to be almost immediately consumed by any flame that happened to hit it?
Based on what's been presented to me, yes, I agree.
I see the time, Your Honour.
Yes, thank you. We'll take the morning break for 15 minutes. Now, I'm conscious that Ms. Sluter is here and also that Mr. Robinson is in court.
Yes.
And if Mr Robinson wanted to take longer than 15 minutes to go and get a proper cup of coffee, how long do you think you'll be?
I would hope not to be more than another half hour.
Right.
So,
Mr Reid?
I won't be long in re-examination, but we do have other witnesses before Mr Robinson.
Right.
We have Mr Needham, who I anticipate will be fairly short. He's down from Devonport and was down yesterday.
Right.
And we have Mrs Sutcliffe, who should be extremely short.
Hmm.
say not before 2 o'clock.
Yes, I think it'd be very safe to say to Mr Robinson, not before 2 o'clock.
All right. Ms Sluiter, would you like some relief, or are you happy to remain? And can you answer for Mr Robinson as to whether he would prefer to come back at 2:15? Well, I'll just give you both the option, I think, either to remain or to come back at 2:15.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes, all right. Well, I'll take a break for 15 minutes, thanks.
All stand, please. This honourable court now stands adjourned.
Just before I forget, that picture.